Mr. President,
may we have order, please, for the senator from Utah?
John. Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I rise today to comment on the results of last night's recall election in the state of Wisconsin. After nearly 2 years of heated political debate, the people of Wisconsin made it clear last night that they are not suffering from buyer's remorse. 2 years ago, they elected leaders committed to solving their state's budget crisis. And last night, they stood by those leaders for making the hard choices that turned Wisconsin's deficit into a surplus. Yesterday's election was very important. It was important because of the example it provides to the nation and the world of how a democracy should work, with citizens who disagree vehemently about policy nonetheless coming together to accept the results of an open and fair election. And it was important because of the message that it sends with respect to public employee unions. Last night's results serve as yet another reminder that the American people want serious answers to our nation's fiscal problems, and they are tired of having labor unions dictate the terms of our economic recovery. Scott Walker never hid his agenda. He ran for office on a platform of reducing state spending, and Governor Walker immediately began addressing the state's problems after taking office. So what egregious acts did Governor Walker commit during his first months in office to trigger this recall? Well, first of all, his budget repair bill actually required Wisconsin state employees to contribute more to their pensions. Prior to passage of the Walker budget, many state employees did not contribute to their retirement benefits. You heard that right. Facing a massive state deficit, Governor Walker determined that Wisconsin taxpayers should no longer foot the entire bill for the generous pensions of public employees. In other words, he asked state public employees to do what private sector employees have done for a generation: contribute to their own retirement plans. Next, he required that state employees pay a larger share of their health care premiums. The new law requires state employees to pay 12.6% of their health care premiums. By contrast, federal employees pay at least 25% of their health care premiums. To put these reforms in terms that his liberal detractors might appreciate, the governor was just asking for a little shared sacrifice. Instead of pitching in, however, the state's public employees pitched a fit. Then, most significantly, Governor Walker reformed the collective bargaining system for state employees. Above all else, it was this decision that triggered the meltdown in Wisconsin last year and ultimately led to the recall. Facing the possibility that a state might successfully limit union influence and excesses, national labor groups turned Wisconsin into the front lines of labor agitation. Now, I know that some have tried to give me a reputation for being anti-union. That's ridiculous because I was raised in the union movement. I held a card for 10 years as I worked as a skilled tradesman in the construction industry. But in fact, I'm not opposed to unionization if that is what employees truly want. I simply believe that workers should be free to choose whether or not to unionize in an environment that is free of coercion or intimidation. And once unions are formed, I do not believe they should enjoy disproportionate bargaining power in their negotiations with management. That said, unions of public sector employees present a unique set of issues for taxpayers and voters. Public sector unions have inherent advantages in negotiations that private sector unions do not. Most notably, public sector unions use their substantial influence in state politics to elect the very officials with whom they will be negotiating their union contracts. As the academic Dan DeSalvo and many others have recognized, when the Ford Motor Company negotiates with the American auto workers, it is an arm's-length negotiation, with both parties having an interest in the ongoing success of the firm. Yet public employee unions effectively negotiate with themselves. There's no distance between them and the public officials that they help to elect and expect payback from. Franklin Roosevelt understood that because public employee unions could elect their own boss. Quote, the process of collective bargaining, as usually understood, cannot be transplanted into the public service, unquote. Now, that was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. George Meany, the first head of the AFL-CIO, knew that this relationship made it, quote, impossible to bargain collectively with the government, unquote. Now, these critical points were lost on today's Democratic Party, which increasingly depends on the foot soldiers and largesse provided by these unions. As a result, we have an untenable situation where public sector unions are, in effect, negotiating against the taxpayers. After all, their salaries and benefits come at the expense of the taxpayers. The fiscal impact of these rigged negotiations is most evident in states with the biggest budget problems. California faces a budget deficit of nearly $16 billion this year alone. It has $65 billion in unfunded liabilities in its teachers' pension system and $136 billion in unfunded liability for its largest city and county employee pension systems. The Illinois Public Employee Pension System now has $83 billion in unfunded liabilities. So far, comprehensive efforts to reform these systems and bring down costs have been stymied for one simple reason. Politicians in those states do not have the courage of people like Governor Scott Walker. And our folks here who support the unions really ought to be happy that this is happening, because they themselves may not be able to accomplish this, but courageous governors like Governor Walker can. And in the end, they're better off as Democrats because you have some reasonable approach towards some of these inordinate problems that are affecting our states. Now, instead of reforming their system, those states have more often opted to raise taxes to attempt to eliminate the shortfalls. Yet most of the states with the highest unfunded liabilities already have higher than average tax rates. Despite their many faults, private sector unions have a stake in the U.S. economy and the profitability of American businesses. Indeed, they have a built-in incentive to ensure continued economic growth. True enough, they do not always act in accordance with that interest, which is probably the biggest reason why today less than 7% of private sector workers belong to a union. But nevertheless, they need some level of continued growth in order to further their existence. Public sector unions are an entirely different animal with a completely different set of interests. Unlike private sector businesses, state governments are not required to turn a profit. State officials are accountable to voters, but unlike stockholders, most voters do not have the same expectations to see returns on their investments. That being the case, public sector unions lack the same incentive to see their negotiating counterparts succeed. There are no forces limiting their incentive to simply maximize benefits for their membership, regardless of what it might cost their employers. In order to succeed, even the most ambitious and shrewd private sector union needs to account for its employer's ability to grow and expand. Public sector unions are not subject to these sorts of limitations. That is probably why they have been so successful. Today, about 37% of government employees belong to a union, which is 5 times the unionization rate in the private sector. So it is easy to see why big labor pulled out all the stops to recall Governor Walker. Public sector unions are the future of the labor movement. Because of the long, steady decline of private sector unions, big labor knows that it must maintain the strength of public sector unions in order to remain relevant. Yet at the same time, the states that employ them face incredibly difficult budgetary decisions in the coming years, and I believe without the ability to be able to get them under control. because of the controls of the major parties. Let's be clear about what it would mean if public employee unions prevailed in these fights. It means that instead of reducing spending, states will have to raise taxes. It means that instead of eliminating government waste, states will have to maintain the status quo. And ultimately, it means that states will have to make a choice between paying their bills on the one hand and growing their economies on the other. Going forward, it is absolutely vital that more states follow Wisconsin's example. States should not have to choose between educating their kids and paying the full freight of public employee pensions. During such difficult economic times, they should not have to raise taxes in order to keep their employees from having to pay a reasonable share of their own benefits. In short, states should have the ability to balance budgetary priorities without being thwarted at every turn by public employee unions that are only concerned with their own interests. Mr. President, last night and this morning, the pundits were in full gear, dissecting the results in Wisconsin and prognosticating about the election's long-term impact. To me, this exercise in democracy demonstrates two things. First, the failure of the unions and the National Democratic Party was not a failure of messaging or money, it was a failure of ideas. Richard Weaver once wrote that ideas have consequences. That is absolutely true. And the ideas that Governor Walker proposed were reasonable ones that addressed a critical fiscal situation without undermining essential services in his state. And second, it is clear that the Democratic Party of Franklin Roosevelt, a party of blue-collar, private sector workers, has morphed into a party dominated by white-collar public workers. And the American people, beginning with Wisconsin, are rejecting this Democratic Party and the priorities of its most influential stakeholders. The silent majority that gets up every day and goes to work in the private sector is losing its appetite for allowing public employee unions to dictate the nation's fiscal policy. There is one video going around of an opponent of Governor Walker's near tears and saying that democracy was denied or is denied tonight. Au contraire. Democracy is alive and well in Wisconsin and around the nation, and the American people are going to have their say. Last night's results should serve as a reminder of the need to face our perilous fiscal situation honestly and squarely. It should also remind us that the American people will not punish leaders who stand up and do the right thing, even in the face of powerful and vengeful opposition. My hope is that the experience in Wisconsin will be replicated around the country. To borrow from one of Wisconsin's patron saints, Vince Lombardi, winning is a habit. Unfortunately, so is losing. The unions have now had 3 bites at the apple since Governor Walker was first elected, and each time they have come up short. By prevailing, Governor Walker and Republicans in Wisconsin should stiffen the spines of conservatives who might have been previously unwilling to take on these public sector unions, public employee unions, if you will. And by losing, those unions have shown themselves to be increasingly desperate and out of touch with the sentiments and concerns of everyday citizens and taxpayers. Mr. President, I commend Governor Walker in his efforts to secure a prosperous future for the citizens of Wisconsin. His courage in the face of significant opposition is a model of statesmanship, and I look forward to working with him for many years to come. Look, we all know that public sector unions have been out of control for a long time, and that includes our country. That includes the federal government employee unions, where the average pay is $80,000 a year compared to around $50,000 for the private sector average pay. We all know that that's justified in the eyes of some because it is so expensive to live in Washington, D.C. or nearby. And why is that expensive? Because we've built the federal government at all costs, And we've allowed it just continue to spend and spend and spend till we now have control by public sector unions who demand more expenditures rather than more ways of living within our means. There's a part of me that wishes that we could move a number of these agencies out of Washington and put them out with the real people throughout our country who have to live within their means and who really don't have to have huge Washington, D.C. pays, which are huge to the average person, maybe not huge to people who work in this very expensive town, and where they can really mingle with the everyday people in this country who are paying the freight. By the way, we all know that according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, the bottom 51% of all households don't pay any income tax freight. There's a method in that madness, it seems to me, but it's the wrong method. And sooner or later, we're all going to have to help pull the wagon and not just sit in the wagon and take advantage of everybody else. It ought to be done on a reasonable and decent basis. But we all know that the public sector unions are out of control. And the states where they have the biggest problems are the states where the public sector unions have dominated their elected politicians over and over and over again, so that the elected politicians are afraid to take them on, afraid to do the things that really would straighten out their states, as Governor Walker has done. Now, instead of finding a lot of fault with Governor Walker, if I was a Democrat, I'd be saying, oh boy, thank God somebody stood up. The fact of the matter is that he has stood up, and he should be given credit for that, not condemnation. And I watched some of the really outrageous things that some of the people in Wisconsin, few of the people, of course, tried to pull on him. And frankly, I am very proud of the people of Wisconsin for standing up the way they did. I think other states are going to have to do that too, or there are going to be problems like you've never seen before. You can name them. You can name the states. In almost every case, they are blue states. Mr. President,